When I was going to school in Ottawa, the first couple of years I went back home for the weekends, and so I went to church in Smiths Falls where I'd always gone. But once I was staying weekends in Ottawa, I came here. And in my third year at university, I used to take the bus so that I could come here for Tuesday night prayer meeting. I could come out and hear men praying about old ladies who had fallen down and hurt their hips, or people who were worried about that their gospel outreach wasn't going to go as well as they hoped. When I was a kid, this was often the site of young people's weekends or all-day meetings. All-day meetings were something like you had gone to meeting on Sunday 3 times, and on Tuesday night and on Thursday night, and they decided we're going to have all-day meetings on Saturday because it's January 1st or July 1st or something. And what that meant was Saturday you could have sermons all day, starting in the morning till at night. When I was at university and I was coming here, something kind of disturbing was happening. The whole place was sort of dividing into 2 factions of people. There were the old people and the people who followed the old people. And they wanted things to stay the way they'd always stayed. They liked songs about tell us the old story, and they used the translation from 1611, the King James translation. And when they prayed to God, they said things, we ask thee, O God, that thou wouldst in thy infinite mercy. They used kind of, Victorian English was how I'd describe it. And there was another faction. People who were middle-aged, people who had teenage kids, young people in their 20s, who saw what was going on in all the other churches. All the other churches were having kind of rock band, guitar worship and stuff like that. And this is a Plymouth Brethren assembly, so no organ, no piano, and certainly no guitar. And the most modern music that would be sung at a place like this had been written when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. So there was no change, nothing new. And some people wanted some change. People were doing things like bringing in new songs or saying, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to read from the New International Version of the Bible. Or when I pray to God, I'm going to say, oh God, I ask that you would do something instead of that thou wouldst do something. And this really upset the old people. They had been coming to church their whole lives many times a week, and this was unacceptable. So there was always this kind of struggle. So when I was going to school, there were kind of shots fired on both sides of that argument. There'd be the Sunday night gospel meeting, and they'd ask a young person to do it because frequently, you needed to have lots of speakers. So you'd ask someone who was about 21 to stand up and preach the gospel. Maybe he'd quote from a book that had been written in the 1980s instead of the 1880s. And one time that happened, there was an old guy shouting up from the back and heckling. It was getting a bit ugly. I went to a prayer meeting here where they didn't pray until the very end because what they were doing was jumping up and reading Bible verses about lying because they were kind of, hinting that the other side were lying about things and they were going to do something about it. Third year university, I got a pretty bad place. That's that green door right there. It was a nice enough little apartment, but it was the landlord, the manager, and the co-tenants that were the problem. The rent was collected by a gay guy named Bob. And Bob had a habit of kind of coming over to collect rent at unexpected hours, and if he went to deliver rent to him, he tended not to be wearing his pants. The other thing that Bob did at the end of his tenure was he took all of the rents and ran away with them. When I lived here, my place got burgled twice, which meant that I lived my last year of university on the insurance money from having all my stuff stolen from here. I suspect it was stolen by people living in the building. One good thing about living here was I found out that my friend Pete had actually been living, unbeknownst to me, through the alley and on the other side of this building here. So if I wanted to visit Pete, I literally just walked like this through this alley and up the front porch to his place. 1989 was a December from hell. Every morning I'd shower and I'd get up and I'd go to the bus. Because Lockwood Sight and Sound in Smiths Falls had been a licensed Radio Shack dealer, I decided that I would work at Radio Shack. And the Radio Shack that I got stationed at was here in the Gloucester Mall, way on the other side of Ottawa. About 10 years ago, Radio Shack left Canada and got replaced with The Source by Circuit City. So all the Radio Shack stores are now The Source.
Radio Shack, Canada's value leader in electronics, makes it easy to shop for Christmas gifts. There's a wide selection of cellular phones for calls on the go, or decorator and cordless phones for everyone. Personal computers for home or office, supported by our sales and service team. The latest VCRs and camcorders for Christmas memories, plus everything in stereo to enjoy the season sounds. Exciting electronic action toys and video games for kids of all ages. All at Radio Shack, Canada's value leader in electronics.
I sold more watch batteries, stuff for cable TV, and the game system that we were selling, we didn't have Nintendo and we didn't have Sega. We had something called TurboGrafx 16.
Are you one of us? 16-bit graphics, or one of them? 8-bit. Us. CD game sound. Them, not. Us. Them. Us. Turbo Express Portable. Buy TurboGrafx 16 now and get one of 38 selected games free.
Games for TurboGrafx 16 had better graphics, but they did not have Mario and they did not have Sonic. I can't tell you how many times I ate breakfast, lunch, and or supper in this food court, eating Chinese, Japanese, Lebanese, or Mexican food, which is my preference. I worked at Radio Shack with a guy named Ray primarily, and Ray enjoyed being kind of humorously rude to customers, not unlike Randall and Clerks. Going around to the front of this building, behind me here there was an East Indian guy named Benny, and Benny was a heroin addict, and so he did crazy things like sell everything in his apartment, get a Sharpie marker and draw a giant mural on the wall of the planet Earth cracking open with all the people pouring out and climbing up into the open wound of the crucified Jesus, taking 3 walls of his apartment. He also did things like try to shave his head but get too zoned out, so nod off in the middle of the floor with this clock radio in his lap turned up full blast, distorting Rick Astley, so that when you came and knocked to tell him to be quiet, you just find him there, completely out of it, with half of his head shaved and the radio turned up full blast at 3 in the morning. That and the fact that the stripper who lived upstairs moved out after her boyfriend kicked in all the drywall, leaving her pet ferret loose in the hall, meant that this was a place I had to move out of, right in the middle of my school year. And so I moved right back into this building where I'd been second year, only this time I was at a room at the back. The 3 years of my education is such a blur that I know I took classes in some of these buildings, but I can't even remember seeing them before. When I think about Ottawa U, I think about huge, to me, imaginary sums of money that were being borrowed so that I could come here, so that I could become a teacher. And most of what I was studying really had nothing to do with me becoming a teacher. And most of the time, I wasn't reading the books I was supposed to read. I wasn't going to the classes. I was depressed. I was confused. I was trying to work out my religion. It was altogether wasted on me. When I look around, there's a huge amount of money here. This place has grown gigantically since even I was here. And I feel like when I was here, I had other, to me, more important things to think about. I was not ready to be here. I barely scraped through. When I was graduating university, I had still never been to a movie theater. And every day when I worked in this mall, there were movies that were being shown at the Cineplex down the mall from where I was working at Radio Shack. I never went to one. So a year after, living in Smiths Falls, when I was going to go to the movie theater for my first movie theater movie, I came back to this mall even though I didn't work here anymore. And up this end was a multiplex. It was 1991, and the movie was Star Trek VI.
The galaxy. stands at a crossroads.
This is the Starship Enterprise. We've been ordered to escort you to your meeting on Earth.
Guess who's coming to dinner?
I have so wanted to meet you, Captain. One warrior to another.
Right.
On the verge of peace.
The undiscovered country. The future.
On the brink of war.
We come in peace, and you blatantly defy that.
We haven't fired.
According to our databanks we have, I shall blow you out of the stars.
Now, the crew of the Starship Enterprise
Will not be the instigators of full-scale war on the eve of universal peace.
They're coming about.
Battle stations.
fights not to win battles,
Incoming.
Signal our surrender.
Captain?
We surrender!
but to end them.
When I went into the movie theater, I was nervously looking around, seeing if there's anyone from my church that might have seen me go in there, because this was a den of iniquity. This was a very clear sign that I was not going to be a proper Plymouth Brethren person. The thing about me was I wasn't going to sneak into a movie theater and then tell myself I'd never done that and lie about it. If I went into a movie theater, I was going to admit it, and it wasn't going to be a secret. And that meant that I was taking a very clear stance against everything I'd been taught. I grew up being told that if I were to go into a movie theater, then I was pretty much saying, I'm not even a proper Christian person. I'm just a damned soul headed for hell. Because that's how they behave. They entertain themselves, they eat, they drink, they are merry, and then they die and go to hell. Christians say no to all this fun stuff. One day we go to heaven, where there's none of this fun stuff either. I could not believe when I saw Star Trek VI how big the screen was, how loud it was. There was Kirk, there was Spock. It was going to be the last Star Trek movie with all those guys in it. And I was just barely, before it left theaters, getting to see that. One of the things I could not get over was the fact that you couldn't pause it, you couldn't turn the volume down. There was people everywhere, and they were talking and laughing and making noise and eating popcorn, and I was thinking, this is really going to take a while to get used to. And by the time I graduated and gone home, back to Smiths Falls to live with my parents again with my university degree, by that point, things had got so sour that there were two factions. There were lots of arguments in this parking lot, apparently, and a lot of nastiness and sniping and gossiping and sides taken, and people with the same last names banding together against people with other last names, or people betraying their own last name. All sorts of human nastiness was going on. And eventually what happened was some guys, people mostly middle-aged, decided that they weren't being listened to, that they didn't have a voice, they didn't have a say, that they weren't being allowed Christian freedom. And they decided to call in some people from neighboring Plymouth Brethren assemblies. And so they did. They invited people from some neighboring Plymouth Brethren assemblies to come here and mediate. What happened is the old guard refused to show. And in fact, what the old guard did was they announced that that meeting was canceled. But the young guard said, it's not canceled, we're having it. If you don't show, then you don't get a voice. And the old guard said, it's canceled, you better not show. And then what the old guard did is they stationed someone in the parking lot here, in his car, to write down the names of everybody who did show, which gave them kind of a list of who the young guard were, formally, so they could work on punishing them. Because of this kind of behavior, the young guard decided that they were going to meet somewhere else. They booked a room to do church Sunday mornings here at the Walter Baker Center across town. As you can see, it's a pretty big sports complex. Although primarily a sports facility, it's also possible to rent conference rooms in the Walter Baker Center. So they started meeting here, and they did church exactly the same in the typical Plymouth Brethren way, with a few changes that if someone wanted to read a Bible verse from a different translation other than the King James, they were free to do that. And if they were wanting to sing maybe a new song that had been written since 1881, maybe they'd do that. It wasn't really very different, though, and quite a few people were meeting here. What they did was they sent this letter around the world saying that they were doing this, and that they were doing it, and they were free to do it, and that they're willing to answer any questions anyone might have as to why they felt the need of doing it. So what happened was, Sunday morning and the weeknight meetings, the old guard and their kids would show up here. There's a bunch of people who no longer were showing up here because they were across town at the Walter Baker Center. The guys here said, we got to do something about that. We can't just let them do that. These guys are meeting in independency.
Are you one of us or one of them?
These guys are rebellious. They're not obedient to the clear teachings of the Word of God. So what they did is they wrote a letter, this letter, and they sent this letter all over the world. What this letter says is that sadly, there's these guys whose names we'll give you, and they're meeting at Walter Baker Center in independence, clear disobedience to the Word of God, with no regard for Christian behavior. And so we're going to have to read them out of fellowship. We're going to have to punish them. We're going to kick them out. These guys, if they show up in Pennsylvania and they'd like to preach the gospel in your area, have nothing to do with them. If they invite you to a young people's weekend, do not send your kids. If they want to show up at a Bible conference that you're having, you're going to have to inform them that we're sorry, we can't accommodate you or give you food or give you a place to stay. You're not invited, you're not welcome. Nobody in the rest of the Plymouth Brethren world, it seemed, really wanted to know anything about what went on here. And the majority of the Plymouth Brethren world ignored them completely. So almost everybody, all over America and Canada and Europe, just decided that this letter from this street address here is close enough to being legit that they would just go with it. So those people were lost to this gathering. Those people at Walter Baker Center, in most cases, the Plymouth Brethren world never saw them again. A lot of families were cut in half. But weirdly, even to this day, there are little pockets all over the planet where there are people who went with this side of the decision. And so you'll find people who are in Egypt who sided with these guys. So about 60% of the population, majority of them being middle-aged and younger, left this place. Didn't come back. Have never come back. And it was heavily skewed to the old and the conservative. Obviously, the conservatives had kids, and so there were some children, but generally speaking, the teens and the 20s left in droves. And what happened here is everybody announced, oh, we're having very happy meetings. Had a lovely meeting last week. Which is, I think, brethren for, F you, we don't miss you at all. We don't care that you left. At least that's how I read it. I'm a bit of a cynical bastard. When I started working at Nortel, I moved from Osgood to here, in Bell's Corners. Lived in this housing development and had roommates for the first and only time in my life. I had two roommates. Started out with Dave. Dave lived on the upper floor and I had the basement apartment as usual. And then we invited Bill, and Bill moved in, and we all got jobs at Nortel, up the street from here.
You know, you gotta get that word right. It's just a funny moment.
Cool.
Yeah.
You ran into my car?
No, I ran your car.
Oh, cool.
Stop filming me or I'll kick your ass. I'm gonna use the taser on Bill.
No.
From magnitude I have not seen since Godzilla attack. You look really wealthy and get ripped off on the street.
Yeah, that's right. Look at this thing. It's from the Sierra Club.
Why, it's a wonderful looking watch.
And it has Japanese movement, which means it tells time backwards and in a language I don't understand.
I just thought that I could redo the original Doctor Who opening for a lot less money, to win $30. Breakfast. Anything that makes good television, even if it ruins relationships.
Crispy edges.
I will try them, my king.
Michael says that these were sent from Japan. And these are the wonderful tasty treats of little Japanese boys who join the army when they are 8. And this is corporal and this is a private. And what this says, this special food package is called Hayatsi! And this one is called Hayato! And this one here is called Hayato with cheese. It's a tasty treat.
You waiting for something?
Cool for guitar music. Maybe you should sing
chords. You're stretching 2 chords. You're already doing better than Tom Petty.
That's true. I met a man who sang to me about thermometers, but they weren't just any ordinary thermometers. They were rectal thermometers that he made down the soup.
Okay, yeah, Mr. Mike.
I just beg you, go away. I don't have any time for clever tricks and jokes and jakes and things. You're just going to have to... No, you cannot suckle at my breast. No! Stop. We're in public. Those are private things.
Oh, that tickled. I kind of like that. Do it again. You're my new squeeze.
So we'd work at Nortel, and we worked all different shifts. So some of us are working days, some of us are working afternoons, some of us are working nights. And sometimes we didn't see each other very much. But exciting things were we got cable TV, and we would sometimes go and rent a Nintendo 64 from the Blockbuster. We preferred playing the Star Wars games. That's the ones that we really liked. Well, with all the working night shift and weekends at Nortel, I wasn't going to church very much. I also wasn't that into it because the things they were teaching were directly contradictory to what I was reading in the Bible and what I was believing in my heart. And I wasn't interested in going to a different church, but I wasn't too interested in what was happening there. So I was going to church instead of a bunch of times a week. I was going once or twice a month, and that was really upsetting some of the old guard there. So one day, I got a phone call here asking if I could present myself at the residence of one of the older brothers, one of the guys who was in charge of causing the 1991 division, and reading out the names of all those people who went to Walter Baker. I was between cars that month, and so I had to be picked up and taken there to this little house by one of the guys who was in charge of the division that happened at Falaise Road. And I was brought here. I went in, and I sat down with 3 of the men who were senior men in Falaise Road, and I was questioned within an inch of my life. I was questioned about my doctrine, what I believed about the Bible, my habits, whether I drank alcohol or not, who my friends were, and eventually was sent on my way. A couple weeks later, a registered letter arrived here that I had to sign for. This letter informed me that I was a wicked person, a profane person, and that I was no longer in fellowship, that I had been officially, in writing, put away from the Lord's table. Now that's brethren talk for saying that I wasn't allowed to worship with the brethren people, and I wasn't allowed to eat with them. They weren't to shake my hand. If there were Bible conferences or social events, I was not invited. I was not to attend until such time as I got things right with them. Now, what normally happens in brethren circles is this lasts for about a month or something. Then they come and meet with you, and you apologize, and they let you back in. Trouble was, I wasn't really apologizing. I didn't seem to want to go to church very often, and I drank a beer on occasion, and I went to movies. So I phoned and asked about getting back in, and they sent the same 2 guys, and this time they came and visited me here in the living room. So they came in, and they sat down, and they pretty much told me that, God shows up at church. God shows up Sunday morning, and he shows up for the 2 weeknight meetings. That's 3 times. The other 2, he doesn't show up at, but at those 3, he shows up. And if there's ever an opportunity to be in the presence of God, they mentioned the Queen and how if the Queen was going to be here, how we would be in her presence. But if there was an opportunity to be in the presence of God, and I was going to pass that up and not show up and work instead or sleep or something, that this just didn't make any sense at all. And what kind of a Christian was I? And they also told me that it didn't matter how many meetings I attended, or what I apologized for, or what I believed, or what I did, so long as the people there didn't feel they understood me, so long as they felt that I believed or lived or thought in a way that didn't make a whole lot of sense to them, that I would never be a member again, that I would remain in this position of being a wicked person, of being shunned worldwide to perpetuity, that I was never getting back in. And so that's what they basically told me. They said that until they understood me, until they got me and felt comfortable with me, I was out. I told them that shunning me and refusing to eat with me and not letting me attend any of their functions seemed counterproductive in terms of reaching a point where they could understand or get me. And they found that to be snide and sarcastic and told me that. Before Nortel more or less went out of business, this was a Nortel facility, and I worked here for years. It's one of those jobs where they kept telling you, sorry guys, we got to lay you all off, and then they'd say, you know what, no, just kidding, you're not laid off. You can just keep working, and then next week, oh, you're laid off, and then, no, you're not laid off. And I worked all different hours, and I was a wreck. I'd worked here for 4 years, and I was a zombie. I had nothing much going on besides weekend night shift, 12-hour shifts, and nonsense like that. Well, one of the best songs that I've ever written came out of this. All I had was working at Nortel and a bit of recording music on the side. So, it was October. I was told I was laid off. I worked a shift that ended after buses run, so I would have to walk home, which I kind of resented, working a long, hard shift and then having to walk home. It was a pretty cold night in October. What I often found happened with me is I would write kind of a jokey or sarcastic, snarly song, and there'd be a more earnest song waiting to happen. So I was walking on this same path, and the snarly one came to me. Because what had happened was, in addition to the work stuff, there's a bass player who had agreed to play on some songs with me, and I talked to him on the phone, and he said no, I was busy, wasn't going to be able to do it. And there was a girl who kind of liked her. She was very pretty, she was very flaky. I've got a real weakness for flaky, pretty chicks. And she wasn't going to be talking to me anymore either. So I wasn't feeling it. So I was walking down this road, and a song came to me, so I sang it quietly to myself. And it was the sarcastic one. There was this woman, she said she would go with me. Now she says that she's sorry, she's just too busy. And it makes me feel special, yeah, it makes me feel special. Yeah, it makes me feel special, 38 special. Which is kind of a stupid song, so I never really did record that until just now. But while that song was percolating in my head, and I was singing it, a better one came to me, and it went a bit differently. There was this woman, a restless beauty. We'd lock our eyes as we wrestled minds. Now she says she's busy, I don't get to know her, and I'm all alone this October night. Doors ending cold, doors ending cold this year. I'm feeling very old, but I'm finding self-control for years. So I guess it isn't odd that I'm chasing after God with my fears. And I'm walking home alone with the wind screaming in my ears. Screaming in my ears. Maybe someday I'll gaze on heaven, but now my life is cold and empty. I'm all alone, walking home in darkness. Gave my best, and now it's gone. There was a place where I was working. I put my life on hold to keep employed. Now that it's not busy, they've sent me packing, and I'm walking home feeling underjoyed. Maybe someday I'll gaze on heaven, but now my life is cold and empty. I'm all alone, walking home in darkness. Gave my best, now it's gone. Maybe someday I'll gaze on heaven, but now my life is cold and empty. I'm all alone, walking home in darkness. Gave my best, and now it's gone. And now it's gone. F you, we don't miss you at all. We don't care that you left. What's really weird is that almost exactly 10 years later, something kind of similar went down here. What happened then is exactly the same people who were the old guard in the previous division were getting a bit heavy-handed with their bossing of people around and their censorship of people's opinions and the shutting down people who had differing opinions. And some guys didn't agree with them. And what they did this time was pretty interesting. What they did this time was they basically decided that they didn't want this hall. They rented this place like a month in advance. And then when the division happened, how they authored this division was they phoned around to all the different people and they said basically, next Sunday, show up here at the room that we booked in the Embassy West Conference Center. If you don't show up here, we're going to read your name as being kicked off the membership roll worldwide. The thing about Plymouth Brethren closed assemblies, they don't have a list of people who are members, who are in fellowship, but they certainly have a list of people who aren't members, aren't in fellowship. What that means is if you show up, you can't take communion. And if it's time to eat supper, you got to go home. The people who had stayed here through the division had another division to deal with, and what they had to do was they had to go across town to the Embassy West Hotel and meet there at the conference center. And so that's what happened. The vast majority of the people who had gone to Falaise Road their whole lives in fear and trembling came here. The few who didn't were kicked out and remained there. Very few families stayed here. That Sunday they showed up here to an almost gutted congregation, almost nobody in there. And they said, no, we're not leaving and we're not bowing to this. There was the first division and we bowed to these tyrants. We're not doing it a second time. Here's where we are. So this giant empty place and most of the people gone. I came back here one Sunday a few years ago and there were literally, besides myself, 8 people in this room. And the youngest person in the room was in her 30s. So they met here, Embassy West Conference Center, for some time, until eventually booking something else. This is now an old folks' home, fittingly enough.